I had always thought of our marriage as steady, if not perfect. Chrissy and I met during college at a campus fundraiser where she volunteered tirelessly, impressing everyone with her unyielding optimism. Her kindness was magnetic, drawing me in. I never imagined that years later the same open heart that made me fall in love with her could also be a double-edged sword. When our first child was born, we faced the typical struggles of young parents: sleepless nights, endless bills, and the balancing act between work and home. But Chrissy seemed tireless. She'd pack lunches, attend PTA meetings, and still find time to work part-time as a nurse. I tried to support her as best as I could, but the demands of my job at the dealership often left me exhausted and unavailable. Over time, cracks began to show. Chrissy became more distant, retreating into her role as a caregiver not just for our kids, but for anyone who needed her. I admired her compassion, but felt it often came at the expense of our relationship. Conversations became shorter, dates were rare, and the laughter that once filled our home seemed to fade into the background. 2 years ago, I noticed a subtle change. Chrissy began staying late after her shifts, claiming she needed to help patients or finish paperwork. At first, I didn't think much of it. Chrissy had always been dedicated to her work, but when she started coming home with a faraway look in her eyes, I began to worry. I tried to address it several times, suggesting we go to counseling or take a weekend getaway to reconnect. But each time, Chrissy brushed me off with the same excuse: "It's just a busy time at work. Things will settle soon." I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I sensed something wasn't right. The tipping point came a week ago when Chrissy mentioned a friend from work, a young man named Bruce, who had recently lost his wife. She spoke about him with a warmth that felt out of place even for her. I chalked it up to her natural empathy, but a gnawing doubt lingered. It wasn't until last night's revelation that my suspicions were confirmed, and my world came crashing down. I awoke with a throbbing pain in my head and dragged myself into the bathroom, fumbling for some painkillers. My stomach churned violently, forcing me to linger near the toilet. As I crouched there, vivid recollections of the prior day flooded back with an intensity that left me breathless. My name is Ron Jameson, and yesterday, my wife Chrissy unraveled my entire world with a devastating confession. When I returned home from work, Chrissy admitted she'd been involved with another man for a year and had developed deep feelings for him, though she claimed her love for me remained. It began, she said, as an attempt to provide solace after the loss of his wife in a tragic accident. Over time, their bond grew stronger, culminating in a deeply passionate relationship. Despite this, Chrissy assured me she wasn't leaving permanently. She planned to stay with him only as long as he needed her, all while maintaining her role as a wife and mother. She said he was younger and would eventually move on, but until then, she felt obligated to support him. Shocked and furious, I lashed out, calling her names I'm not proud of. Chrissy shot back, accusing me of failing to honor our wedding vows and insisting that if I truly loved her, I'd accept the situation. Hangry and devastated, I turned to booze to cope. Once I calmed down enough to think, I asked how she'd feel if I found someone else. Her reply stung: "Who'd want you?" She called me an overweight, balding middle-aged man and warned me the divorce would ruin me financially and emotionally. Enraged, I drank and yelled until she packed a bag and left for her lover's house. The next morning, I forced myself to take stock of my life. Chrissy wasn't wrong about my appearance. I was out of shape, middle-aged, and losing my hair. While I couldn't change my age, I could at least work on my health. But first, I needed to figure out where my kids were. I searched the house but didn't find them. Just as I was about to call Chrissy's parents, her car pulled into the driveway. The kids got out and walked toward the house. At the door, Chrissy greeted me with a cutting comment about my sobriety. When I demanded to know where the kids had been, she casually mentioned they'd stayed at her lover's house. I asked why she didn't take them to her parents instead, but she said they weren't home. Dismissing my outrage, she brushed past me and headed upstairs. "Are you staying here or are you going back to him?" I asked. She sighed, clearly annoyed. "Ron, stop acting like a child. I've already explained this. I love you, but I'm staying with him until he no longer needs me." Trying to stay calm, I asked, "And what about the kids? If you don't want to take care of them, call my parents." She replied before packing another bag and leaving. I stood there, head pounding, trying to hold myself together for the kids, but I wasn't going to let her betrayal slide. I still had my dignity. After she left, I checked on the kids and asked about their homework. They'd grown but got to work when I promised we'd visit their grandparents afterward. The kids loved going to Chrissy's parents' farm, where their grandfather Sam was helping them build go-karts. Sam, a retired handyman with a fully stocked workshop, was more than just a grandparent. He was a mentor. While the kids worked, I reflected on how much they meant to me. Rahman, 16, was dedicated to football, though he wasn't big enough for a scholarship. Sally, 15, loved to test boundaries but excelled in school. Kyle, 11, was our surprise baby and Chrissy's little one. Though he hated the nickname, his cheerful spirit was a bright spot in an otherwise dark time. I made coffee and started a to-do list. My first call was to my boss, Bob Clarkson. I've worked at the local Ford dealership for 23 years, with Bob as my boss for the last 15. I explained what had happened, and he immediately offered his support. Bob shared a story about his son's messy divorce, which involved false accusations and intervention from his ex-mother-in-law, who ultimately saved the day by threatening to testify against her own daughter. "That's harsh," I said, shocked. "Harsh doesn't cover it," Bob replied, "but she saved my son's life. He told me to take all the time I needed, and I requested a week off. With plenty of personal days and vacation time banked, he approved it without hesitation, offering additional support if necessary. Before ending the call, I asked Bob if he could recommend a good divorce lawyer. Without hesitation, he suggested Dwight Tucker, an attorney who had won primary custody for his son and even secured child support payments from the ex-wife. "Tucker's ruthless," Bob said. "If you need someone who'll fight tooth and nail, he's your guy." With a clearer plan beginning to form, I felt a faint sense of control, though I knew the road ahead would be anything but smooth. After rummaging for a moment, Bob found Dwight Tucker's business card and read out the number. I decided to call right away, even though it was a Saturday, and I assumed I'd just leave a voicemail. To my surprise, luck was on my side. Tucker's secretary answered and said he'd had a last-minute cancellation. "If you can be here in 30 minutes, he'll see you," she told me. I quickly told the kids to behave while I stepped out for an hour and drove to Tucker's office, making it there in under 20 minutes. Dwight Tucker turned out to be a sharp-looking man in his mid-30s. A bit shorter than me, he had piercing blue eyes and a warm, confident smile that likely worked wonders with juries, especially female jurors. "What brings you in today?" he asked once I'd settled into a chair across from him. Taking a deep breath, I started. "Yesterday, my wife told me she's been cheating on me with a younger man." My face flushed as I spoke, anger and humiliation battling for dominance. I recounted the events of the previous day as briefly as I could. Tucker listened carefully, jotting down notes and occasionally shaking his head. When I got to the part where Chrissy claimed she still loved me but was determined to continue her affair, he raised a hand to stop me. "Let me get this straight," he said, his expression darkening. "She says she loves you with plans to keep seeing this guy." Embarrassed, I nodded, my face burning. "Go on," he prompted, leaning forward slightly. I explained how Chrissy had blown up at me for refusing to accept her arrangement and how I'd insulted her in my anger. I admitted I'd called her degrading names and shared how she'd laughed when I suggested finding someone else. The hardest part to relay was how she had cruelly belittled me, calling me undesirable and threatening to ruin me if I pursued a divorce. "She actually said that." Tucker asked incredulously. "No offense, Mr. Fremont, but your wife either has a heart of stone or she's got some serious issues." "None taken," I sighed, nodding. I'd been wondering the same thing. I went on to tell him how Chrissy had left our kids at her lover's house after our argument and allowed them to spend the night there. Tucker's pen paused mid-note and he glanced up with a slight smile before jotting something down. "Now the big question," he said, folding his hands in front of him. "What do you want to do?" I took a moment to think, staring at the floor. Finally, I said, "I can't live like this. I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to forgive her, but I do know I can't let her destroy me or take my kids." Tucker nodded sympathetically. "Unfortunately, that's a common pattern with people in her situation. But here's the good news. I'll work tirelessly to protect your rights and minimize the damage. If this does go to divorce, you'll get at least half of your shared assets. That said, I needed to warn you the courts typically don't care about infidelity." Hearing this, my heart sank. "So I'll still have to pay alimony and child support." "That's possible," Tucker admitted, "but that's why we need to act fast and aggressively. Right now, your wife has left the marital home and even worse, she took your kids to stay at her lover's house. Judges don't look kindly on that kind of behavior. You currently have custody and will fight to keep it that way. If you're granted primary custody, you won't have to pay child support." "By the way, does your wife work?" "She does," I said. "Part-time at the hospital, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Honestly, that's probably where she met this guy." Tucker nodded thoughtfully. "How much does she make?" "About $25,000 a year," I replied. "I make around $80,000. Tucker paused, his gaze serious. "I need you to think carefully about this next question. Do you still love her? Do you want to try and save the marriage?" I looked down, staring at the floor for a long moment. When I finally raised my head, tears were streaming down my face. "Yes," I admitted, my voice cracking. "I do love her, but I can't live with what she's done. She's humiliated me and broken our vows. I'm done." "Understood," Tucker said, flipping to a clean page in his notebook. "Now let's go over your assets. Tell me as much as you can about what you and your wife own. I took a moment to mentally list everything we owned. We got about $3,500 in our checking account. I started. There's $44,000 in savings, plus a CD worth $20,000, not counting interest. My 401 has around $150,000, and Chrissy's retirement fund is a bit smaller since she hasn't worked as long as I have. However, the hospital where she worked full-time offered a better benefits package back then. Surprisingly though, my company's health plan is better, so that's what we use for the family. I paused before adding, we'd also have 2 cars, both jointly owned, and then there's the house. We bought it just a few years ago with a maxed-out loan, so there's not much equity yet. Dwight nodded, his expression shifting to one of focused determination. Here's what I want you to do, he said, his tone all business. Withdraw half of the money from your checking and savings accounts and deposit it into a new account under your name only. I can't touch the CD, I pointed out. It's in both our names and cashing it requires Chrissy's signature. That's fine, Dwight replied, quickly calculating figures. Take $33,750 from savings. Use what's left in checking to pay as many household bills as you can. Cancel any joint credit cards, pay off their balances, and then apply for a credit card in just your name. I still have an individual card I opened before we got married, I told him. I rarely use it because our joint card has cashback rewards. Perfect, Dwight said with a small smile. That makes things even easier for you. He scribbled a list of steps on a notepad and handed it to me. Before you leave, stop by my secretary's desk and have her call Taylor Locksmith to change the locks at your house. Once that's handled, come back in and I'll go over the next steps with you. Miss Carlson called Taylor Locksmith while I waited. After giving them my address, they told me someone would arrive by noon. With that arranged, I returned to Dwight's office where he was just finishing a phone call. Good news, he said, hanging up. If I fax the paperwork today, we'll get Judge Johnson assigned to your case. Why is that good news? I asked, puzzled. Dwight grinned. Judge Johnson can't stand cheaters. He's old school, a true Bible Belt judge, and he doesn't tolerate infidelity, no matter which spouse is at fault. That gives us a significant advantage. Plus, he was a close friend of my father, so he won't mind if I give him a call at home. Dwight stood and extended his hand, which I shook gratefully. Before heading home, handle the banking, Dwight instructed. I'll draft a petition for an emergency restraining order against your wife. If granted, it'll bar her from the house and keep her 500 feet away from you and the kids. The fact that she left the children with her lover will strengthen our case. Even if the order is eventually dismissed, it'll give you time to establish yourself as the primary caregiver at home. By Friday, we'll have her served with divorce papers. Then, we'll see how she responds. For the first time since Chrissy's bombshell revelation, I felt a glimmer of control and dignity returning. The bank wasn't busy, so I quickly withdrew my share of the funds as a cashier's check and closed our joint credit card. The remaining balance was $537, which I paid off using the checking account. I also paid 2 months of mortgage payments in advance, using another $2,600. By the time I finished, there wasn't much left in the account. I deposited the cashier's check into a new checking and savings account under my name at a different bank. With that task completed, I drove home to find the kids glued to the television. Come on, let's head to your grandparents' house, I told them, and we piled into the car. When we arrived at my in-laws' farm, Sam was coming around the corner from his workshop. He waved before disappearing back inside, and the kids eagerly followed him. Inside the house, Mary greeted me warmly, giving me a kiss on the cheek. A moment later, Sam joined us, freshly washed up and ready to chat. I need to tell you something difficult, I began, struggling to find the words. Chrissy is having an affair, and I've decided to file for divorce. Sam's face hardened with disbelief. That's not true, he snapped. Chrissy wouldn't do something like that. What proof do you have? She told me herself, I said quietly, tears welling up in my eyes. Just then, the back door creaked open and the kids came bursting in from outside. Stay outside for a few more minutes, I told them firmly. Why? Ronran asked, his tone defiant. Because I said so, I replied, sharper than I intended. He must have noticed the tears on my face because he quickly turned, ushering his siblings back outside. Chrissy actually admitted this, Mary asked, her voice trembling. Yes, I confirmed, my tone resolute, and there's more. I recounted everything. Chrissy's confession about her affair, her cruel comments about me, her threats to ruin me if I sought a divorce, and even her boast about enjoying closeness with her lover. Both Mary and Sam were stunned, and Sam's expression darkened with anger. I still can't believe this, he muttered. I'm going to call her right now and put it on speaker. After dialing his daughter's number, Sam placed the phone on speaker and set it on the coffee table. Hi, Dad, Chrissy greeted him warmly. What's going on? Ron's here with me, Sam began, his tone serious. Then without preamble, he asked, "Are you having an affair?" The line went silent for several seconds. Then Chrissy's voice, sharp and defensive, broke the tension. "What did he say?" "He told me you're involved with another man," Sam replied evenly, "that you've been intimate with him and that you claim to love him." "It's not what you think, Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm trying to help someone. He's been through a terrible loss, and I can't just abandon him." Sam's face flushed a deep red, his jaw tightening. "Answer the question, Chrissy," he said through gritted teeth. "Are you sleeping with him?" "Yes," she admitted softly, "but I love Ron too. I can't walk away from this other man. I care about him deeply." I was floored. Sam had always treated Chrissy as his golden child. I never expected him to call her out on her behavior. "Chrissy," Sam said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I never thought my daughter would behave like this. I raised you better." "Please, Daddy," she began, but he cut her off by abruptly ending the call. Moments later, the phone started ringing again. Mary reached for it, but Sam shot her a warning look. "Don't answer it." Ignoring him, Mary picked up the phone anyway. Furious, Sam snatched it out of her hand and hurled it against the fireplace, shattering it. "I said, leave it alone," he roared. Mary stepped back, startled by his sudden rage. "Leave it alone," he roared. I sat frozen, stunned by the raw intensity of the moment. The room fell into a heavy silence as Sam and Mary struggled to process this shocking revelation. After a long pause, Sam turned to me, his face filled with regret, and pulled me into a hug. "Ron, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say. I can't believe Chrissy's done this to you. If there's anything we can do to help, we're here for you and the kids, anything at all." He glanced at Mary. "I'll have her speak to Chrissy later. Right now, I can't. I'm too angry." I nodded, thanked them, and left to meet the locksmith at my house. After loading the kids into the car, I hugged Sam and Mary goodbye and invited them to dinner so we could talk further. On the drive home, Sally's soft sobs broke the silence. "Are you and Mom getting divorced?" she asked hesitantly. "Who told you that?" I asked sharply. "I did, Ron," Sally admitted from the backseat. "I went back inside and heard everything. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't think it was this." I sighed heavily, struggling to find the right words. Chrissy's betrayal wasn't just breaking me. It was hurting our children too. She probably hadn't thought about them at all when she chose to have an affair. "It looks like your mom and I are heading toward a divorce," I said carefully. "But why?" Kyle asked, his voice cracking as tears began to fall. "Your mom has developed feelings for someone else," I explained gently. "You mean she's sleeping with another guy?" Sally blurted out, her words laced with anger. "I hate her. She's awful." "Don't talk about your mother like that," I said, though the words felt hollow. In truth, I shared her anger, but I couldn't let my bitterness spill over onto them. When we arrived home, the locks had just been changed. 10 minutes later, Chrissy pulled into the driveway in a fury. "So you ran to my parents, huh?" she yelled, storming inside. "Why did you tell them that I'm some kind of tramp?" "Chrissy," I said, my voice low and tired. "I told them the truth, and for the record, I do love you, but I will never accept this, sharing you with someone else. You shattered my trust, my dignity, and everything we built together. Do you even realize how much it hurt when you told me I'm just an unattractive, middle-aged man who should feel lucky to have you? That was cruel. And now you're asking me to live with this? To accept it? That's not love, Chrissy." She faltered, looking shaken by my words. "I didn't mean it like that," she stammered. "I was just angry when I said those things. But for you to call me names, how could you? I'm your wife, the mother of your children. If you truly loved me, you'd understand. I'm not leaving you for him. I just care about him too. I'm trying to help him. He's younger and going through a rough time. He'll move on eventually." "Chrissy," I said, shaking my head slowly, "if you're going to talk about love, don't forget the part where you vow to be faithful. Helping someone doesn't mean sleeping with them. And as for what I said, yes, I've accepted the situation. You've shown me exactly who you are, and I'm done. You're no longer part of my life. That's your reality now. Accept it." Her eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't muster any sympathy. I had nothing left to give her. Chrissy hesitated, her face flushed and uncertain. For a moment she seemed vulnerable, but then her expression hardened and a familiar arrogance returned. She inhaled sharply, clearly searching for her next angle. "Ron," she began, her voice adopting the patronizing tone she often used with the kids when scolding them. "Stop acting like a fool. I'm your wife. You know me. I love you, and I'll come back to you once this man is better." I stared at her, my sadness giving way to something much colder. "No, Chrissy," I said quietly but firmly. "I don't know you. The woman I married, the mother of my children, was kind, loving, and loyal. You're a stranger. For all I know, this isn't even your first affair. How can I believe anything you say? For all I know, you've been sharing yourself with every man who gives you a sob story." Chrissy's face turned crimson with anger, her eyes narrowing as her chest heaved. "This is not an affair," she snapped. "This is the first time I've slept with anyone since we got married. This man has been through so much, and I'm going to help him whether you like it or not." "Do whatever you want," I replied, my voice cold and devoid of emotion. "But don't expect me to accept this. And since I can't trust you anymore, I'll be arranging DNA tests for the kids. I need to know if they're even mine." Her face twisted with rage. "You're a complete idiot," she spat. "I can see you're determined to turn this into a nightmare. Just remember, I warned you what would happen if you try to divorce me." "Chrissy," I said, shaking my head as I stepped toward the porch. "I'd rather lose everything and live in poverty than stay with someone who has no moral compass." Before she could respond, a sheriff's vehicle pulled up and a deputy stepped out. "Are you Chrissy Jameson?" he asked, clipboard in hand. "Yes, that's me," Chrissy replied, her voice uncertain. "Ma'am," the deputy said, holding out a document. "This is a restraining order. It prohibits you from entering this house or coming within 500 feet of your husband and children. Do you understand?" Chrissy's eyes widened in disbelief. "But this is my home. My things are inside." The deputy remained calm. "You'll be allowed 15 minutes to collect personal belongings," he explained. He glanced at me and I gave him a small nod. "Officer," I said, addressing him directly, "would it be all right if I took my kids to the backyard while she does that?" "I want to see my children," Chrissy exclaimed, her voice desperate. "Ma'am," the deputy said firmly, his tone professional. "The order is meant to protect your children. They'll need to abide by its terms." Chrissy turned on me, her face a mask of fury. "You did this," she shouted. "You're trying to take my children from me." "No, Chrissy," I replied calmly. "You did this to yourself. I simply told the court the truth, that you abandoned your home and left our kids at your lover's house while you were with him." She let out a frustrated scream. "I didn't abandon anyone. He's a wonderful man." "If he's so wonderful," I said with icy sarcasm, "then go be with him. But don't expect any sympathy from me or the court." I took the kids to the backyard and gently explained that their mom was gathering her things to take to her new home. I promised they'd get a chance to see her before she left. When the time came, Kyle burst into tears and ran into Chrissy's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please don't leave Mommy," he begged. Tears streamed down Chrissy's face as she looked at me. "Ron, can't you see what this is doing to them?" I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "Don't," I said coldly. "You don't get to blame me for this. You were the one who brought them into this mess when you dragged them to your lover's house. You made this choice, not me." "Ron, I can't just abandon him," she cried. "Chrissy," I said, my voice sharp as ice. "You abandoned your husband, your children, and your home the moment you chose him. You made your decision. Now live with it. Maybe you didn't think about the consequences, but they're here now. I hope it was worth it." Raman, standing nearby, stared at his mother in disbelief. "Why?" he finally asked. Chrissy fumbled for words, trying to explain herself, but it was obvious he didn't believe her. Before she could say much more, Sally stormed forward. "You're selfish," she hissed, tears streaming down her face. Then to my shock, she spat at her mother. I grabbed Sally, holding her back before things escalated further. "Apologize," I demanded. "No," Sally said flatly, blaring at her mother. Chrissy looked completely broken, falling to her knees and sobbing uncontrollably. I wasn't entirely surprised by Sally's outburst. She and Chrissy had been clashing a lot lately. Still, I worried that Chrissy's actions might permanently damage their relationship. As I held Sally, Chrissy stood, wiped her tears, and ran to her car. She drove off, pounding the steering wheel in frustration. Kyle tried to chase after her, screaming, "Mommy, don't leave us." Ronran caught him and brought him back, holding him tightly as he cried. The deputy approached me, his expression somber. "Mr. Jameson," he said softly, "I'm sorry you're going through this." I nodded but couldn't bring myself to say anything. My family had been shattered, and there was no fixing it now. That evening, Sam and Mary joined us for dinner. I had planned to keep it simple with hamburgers on the grill and a quick salad, but Mary promptly took over the kitchen. She insisted on making her famous meatloaf and macaroni and cheese, a favorite of the kids. While Mary busied herself cooking, Sam and I sat in the living room with a couple of beers. I could see the pain etched on his face. It was clear he was struggling with his daughter's choices. I filled him in on the restraining order and explained that I had filed it because Chrissy had left the kids unsupervised at her lover's house. Sam's shoulders sagged as the weight of the situation bore down on him. "Mary talked to Chrissy about an hour after you left," he said finally, his voice heavy. "How did that go?" I asked, hopeful for some progress. "It was a disaster," Sam admitted. "Mary tried reasoning with her, but Chrissy wouldn't listen. She's convinced she's in the right and that the rest of us are wrong. She even accused us of being horrible people. That's when Mary lost her temper." I've never seen her so angry. The conversation ended with Mary telling Chrissy not to call us again. She also warned her that if this went to court, she'd testify against her. After that night was subdued, the only moment of levity came when Sam invited the kids to work on their go-karts at his shop the next day. Ronrin and Kyle perked up at the suggestion, their smiles a welcome sight. Sally, however, remained withdrawn, pushing her food around her plate with a sullen expression. I decided to let it go, knowing she was hurting as much as I was. Later that week on Friday, Chrissy was served with divorce papers at her workplace. According to friends at the hospital, her reaction was explosive. She reportedly screamed at the process server and vowed to ruin me. The hospital sent her home, though in reality she went to her lover's house. Shortly after, Chrissy hired her own attorney, a woman named Amber Wright. Dwight knew her well, having faced her several times. He described her as overconfident and not nearly as skilled as she believed herself to be. Amber's first move was to attempt to have the restraining order overturned. Judge Johnson, however, was unmoved. The children are safe where they are, he said, dismissing her arguments. The judge did, however, modify the order slightly, allowing Chrissy's supervised visitation at the house. Her boyfriend, however, was prohibited from coming within 500 feet of the property. The judge warned Chrissy that any violation of this rule would result in the revocation of her visitation rights. Chrissy seemed pleased with the modification, but her satisfaction didn't last long. The judge also ordered her to pay child support, an amount significant enough that she'd have to return to full-time work. Despite her outbursts at the hospital, I knew they would take her back. Nurses were in short supply and she was good at her job. Around the same time, the DNA test results arrived in the mail. It took me half the day to work up the courage to open the envelope. When I finally read the report, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief and joy. The results confirmed what I desperately needed to know. The kids were biologically mine. I read the report multiple times to make sure I wasn't mistaken. Then I reflected on what I would have done if the results had been different. In a moment of clarity, I realized it wouldn't have changed my love for them. They were my children, regardless of biology. Still, I knew I couldn't take Chrissy back, even for the kids' sake. Her actions had shattered any chance of reconciliation. I couldn't trust her to set a good example or instill the values our children deserved. I used up all my vacation and personal days to stay home with the kids. When my leave ran out, Sam and Mary stepped in, graciously agreeing to watch them. They remained steadfast in their refusal to speak to Chrissy. She called 3 or 4 times a day for about a week, Sam told me one evening. Eventually, I blocked her number. The visitation schedule was hashed out between our attorneys. Ultimately, Chrissy was allowed to visit the kids on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings from 6 to 7 p.m., with Mary acting as the supervisor. I insisted on being present for the first visit to ensure everyone understood the rules. That Monday, a car pulled up outside and Chrissy stepped out. I didn't recognize the vehicle but quickly deduced it must belong to her boyfriend. Chrissy approached the house nervously, attempting a strained smile. "Hi, Ron. How are you?" "Mother, it's nice to see you," she said, trying to sound pleasant. I cut her off sharply. "Chrissy, you need to leave. The judge explicitly stated that your boyfriend isn't allowed within 500 feet of this house." Panic crossed her face. "But he was just dropping me off," she stammered. "Are you completely clueless?" I snapped. The judge's instructions were crystal clear. "Get him out of here now. If he doesn't leave, I'll report it." Chrissy nodded frantically and hurried back to the car. As she spoke to her boyfriend, I stepped outside and noted the license plate number. Once the car drove away, I returned to the porch. "He'll pick me up later," Chrissy said defiantly. "Tell him to wait down the street," I replied curtly. "I don't want him anywhere near this house." Her face turned red and she glared at me. "Ron, I'm sick of the way you're treating me. You had no right to take money from our account or cancel my credit card." "I didn't take anything that wasn't mine," I said coldly. "The money paid off our shared credit card and 2 months of mortgage payments. I wasn't going to risk losing the house while you were off playing house with your boyfriend. As for the credit card, I wasn't about to be stuck with charges you racked up while gallivanting with him." Chrissy's expression was a mixture of anger and indignation. "This isn't an affair and he's not my lover," she snapped. "You're just being Ann." Before I could say a word, Mary took a decisive step forward and slapped Chrissy across the face. The sharp crack startled both of us, leaving Chrissy wide-eyed and speechless. Chrissy stumbled back, her expression shifting to one of utter disbelief as she stared at her mother. "Chrissy," Mary said sternly, her voice like steel, "if you ever insult Ron again, I swear I'll drag you out of that dress and teach you a lesson you won't forget. The kids are in the living room if you want to see them. I need a moment with Ron and then I'll come in. But listen to me carefully. If you step out of line, I will personally throw you out of this house." Chrissy, looking completely deflated, gave a meek nod and disappeared inside. Mary turned to me with an apologetic look. "Ron, I'm sorry for the way my daughter has behaved. She's acting like she's completely lost her mind." "Thanks for having my back," I said sincerely, grateful for her support. 2 weeks later, as Dwight had predicted, the restraining order was lifted. By then, I had firmly established myself as the primary caregiver, and the court allowed me to remain in the house since Chrissy was still involved with her lover. She was required to continue paying child support, but was now granted unsupervised visitation in public settings. The judge made it clear, however, that Chrissy's boyfriend was not to be present during her time with the kids, nor could she bring them to his home. After months of delays, our first official court date to finalize the divorce arrived. Before any arguments could begin, Judge Johnson asked if either Chrissy or I had attended counseling. Both attorneys admitted that we had not, so the judge mandated 8 sessions of marital counseling before proceeding. I didn't object, though I thought the sessions would be a waste of time. I had a feeling Chrissy saw them as an opportunity to persuade me, or perhaps the therapist, that her actions were justified. The first session with Ann Patterson, our therapist, was exactly as I expected. Chrissy dominated the hour, attempting to rationalize her behavior as the Christian thing to do. I could barely hide my disbelief as Ann listened with a carefully neutral expression. By the second session, Ann began gently challenging Chrissy's arguments. "Do you think it would be acceptable if Ron decided to start a relationship with another woman?" she asked. I braced myself, expecting Chrissy to attack me. To my surprise, she didn't respond immediately. Her hesitation spoke volumes, but I didn't care about her answer anymore. As the divorce dragged on, I made some significant changes in my life. After Chrissy's hurtful comments about my appearance, I was determined to prove her wrong. I decided to undergo a hair transplant. The procedure wasn't extensive, but it still set me back about $4,000. I was initially apprehensive about the decision, unsure if it was worth the teasing I might endure. But since I was already on leave, I figured it was the right time. The procedure involved buzzing my hair short and transplanting hair from the back of my head to the thinning areas in the front. I spent the first week recovering at home, avoiding the outside world. The kids were curious and asked plenty of questions, to which I offered a vague explanation about a minor medical procedure. Within 10 days, I started looking like myself again, and over the following weeks, the new hair began to fill in naturally. Once I recovered, I committed to getting in shape. At first, running even half a mile left me gasping for air and with aching legs, but I kept at it, gradually increasing my distance until I could run 10 miles without stopping. I joined a gym and completely overhauled our household meals, cutting out junk food like pizza, ice cream, and chips. The kids weren't thrilled at first, rumbling about the absence of their favorite snacks. To win them over, I scoured the internet for fun, healthy recipes. Some dishes flopped spectacularly, but we laughed it off, tossed the disasters in the trash, and made sandwiches instead. It became a family activity, with the kids pitching in to help me cook. Despite the lingering pain of Chrissy's betrayal, these moments brought a sense of warmth and hope back into my life. Returning to work was an unexpected confidence booster. When I checked in at the office, Trudy the receptionist gave me a curious look. "Welcome back, Ron," she said brightly. "There's something different about you." I chuckled, a little embarrassed. "I've been working on my fitness, lost 18 pounds so far, hoping to drop a few more." She smiled warmly. "Well, whatever you're doing, it suits you. If I weren't married, I'd be all over you." I laughed awkwardly. "Thanks for the ego boost, but according to Chrissy, I'm just a washed-up middle-aged guy with no appeal." That's why she found herself a boyfriend. Trudy's expression darkened. "Chrissy must be out of her mind. Ron, you're a great guy. Plenty of women would be lucky to have you. Don't let her words get to you." Her encouragement was the first genuine compliment I'd received in months. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't completely worthless. At our next therapy session, Ann asked Chrissy, "How would you feel if Ron came home and told you he was having a relationship with another woman?" Chrissy hesitated before replying. If he was helping her recover from some tragedy, I suppose I'd be okay with it. Ann didn't let up. And if he said he loved her and that their relationship was fulfilling, I'd accept it, Chrissy said, her tone defiant, as long as he made sure the children and I were taken care of. The session continued with Ann methodically dismantling Chrissy's logic. But no matter how many valid points the therapist made, Chrissy refused to back down. It became clear to me that these sessions weren't about healing. They were just another platform for Chrissy to try to justify her actions. As time passed, the initial shock of Chrissy's betrayal began to fade. It's strange how love works. If it isn't nurtured, it gradually withers away. I found myself caring less and less about what Chrissy thought, focusing instead on a life I was building for myself and my children. By the third week of counseling, Chrissy arrived looking far more subdued. She spoke little during the session, mostly listening as Ann gently and methodically deconstructed her justifications. Something had shifted. It seemed Chrissy was beginning to face the consequences of her actions. I also noticed her sneaking glances at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I had continued working out, lost a few more pounds, and spent a lot of time outside doing yard work, which had given me a deep tan. A few months earlier, before counseling had been ordered, I had made another big change in my life. I had grown increasingly dissatisfied with my job. While I loved fixing cars, especially doing body work, working at the dealership was wearing me down. Restoring old vehicles had been my passion since I was 14, and I had become skilled enough to handle any repair. I started thinking about how owning my own shop could give me more time with my kids. I discussed the idea with Sam, who immediately offered his support. He agreed to let me set up a business in his converted barn, which he used as a workshop. The space was perfect, and he even suggested leasing me a section of his land later to build my own facility if things worked out. Setting up the shop wasn't easy. I couldn't quit my job cold turkey as I didn't have the financial cushion to sustain us until the business turned a profit. Using part of the money I had withdrawn from our joint savings and a small loan from Sam, I began purchasing equipment and tools. Sam even helped me build a paint booth in the barn. I started part-time, working evenings and weekends while keeping my job at the dealership. Word spread quickly, and customers began trickling in. The kids loved hanging around the shop, and I taught Ronran how to handle basic repairs. Even Sally pitched in, learning how to change engines and paint cars, something she proudly bragged about to her friends at school. Business grew steadily, and I soon found myself facing a tough decision. One weekend, the dealership asked me to work overtime to help clear a backlog of jobs. I had to decline because I already had commitments to my own clients. I braced myself for the fallout when I approached my boss, Bob, to explain. "Got a minute, Bob?" I asked, stepping into his office. "Sure, Ron," he said, motioning me in. "Glad you're on board this weekend. We've got 44 cars arriving Friday, and they need to be prepped and ready to move by the end of the month." I felt a pang of guilt but pressed on. "That's why I'm here, Bob. I can't work this weekend. I've started my own side business, and I need to honor my commitments to those customers." Bob's face hardened. "If you can't help out, Ron, I might have to let you go." I nodded, resigned. "I understand, Bob. I hope there are no hard feelings. I'm trying to build something for my kids' future and save for their college funds. I'll clean out my locker." Bob sighed. "I hate to lose you, Ron. Tell me about this business of yours. What kind of work are you doing and where's it set up?" I explained the basics. How I was operating out of Sam's property, the equipment I had, and the types of repairs I could handle, including bodywork. "Grab a coffee and come back," Bob said, reaching for the phone. Instead of coffee, I went to pack up my locker, fully expecting to leave. Losing my job would tighten our finances, but I had faith in the growing success of my shop. I'd already removed Chrissy from my health insurance, so the kids would need to switch her plan. When I returned, Bob greeted me with a smile and slid a piece of paper across the desk. "I've got an idea, Ron. This is an independent contractor agreement. I need you this weekend, and I think you can convince your customers to wait a few days. If your shop passes inspection, I'll hire you as a contractor to handle our bodywork." I was stunned but quickly agreed. That weekend, I worked at the dealership while continuing to grow my own business. Within weeks, I was running my shop full-time. Occasionally, I still helped the dealership when they needed an extra hand. Sam joined me part-time and Mary took over the bookkeeping. For the first time, I was earning more money than I ever had at the dealership. The only thing still in disarray was my marriage. By the fourth counseling session, I was completely over it. I no longer cared about Chrissy's relationship with her boyfriend. Sure, it still hurt to think about her with another man, but those moments were becoming less frequent. Chrissy, however, hadn't given up on trying to justify herself. During one session, Anne asked her directly, "How would you feel if Ron came home and told you he was involved with another woman?" Chrissy hesitated before replying arrogantly. "If he was helping her through a difficult time, I suppose I'd understand." Anne didn't let it drop. "And what if he told you he loved her and that their relationship was fulfilling?" Chrissy straightened her shoulders. "As long as he assured me that the children and I would be cared for, I'd accept it." Anne spent the rest of the session picking apart Chrissy's logic, but she refused to budge. These sessions weren't helping, they were just a stage for Chrissy to double down on her beliefs. As time went on, the sting of Chrissy's betrayal began to fade. It's strange how love works. It requires attention and care to survive. Without it, even the strongest feelings begin to wither. I poured my energy into my kids, my business, and rebuilding myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally moving forward. During our fifth counseling session, I decided to address the most painful thing Chrissy had ever said to me. I wasn't going to hold back any longer. When Anne opened the floor for discussion, I turned to Chrissy, my voice steady but filled with emotion. "Chrissy, I've come to realize something about you. You're not just selfish, you're cruel. How could you look at the man you once claimed to love and tell him he's an ugly middle-aged nobody who could never attract another woman? That hurt me in a way I may never fully recover from. Chrissy's face crumpled and tears spilled down her cheeks. "Oh, Ron, I'm so sorry," she cried. "I hate myself for saying that. I wish I could take it back. I really do. I love you. Not enough to stop seeing your boyfriend, though." I shot back coldly. "Say your apologies. You'll need them more than I will." Chrissy broke into uncontrollable sobbing, and despite Anne's best efforts, we couldn't get her to calm down. Eventually, Anne ended the session and gave us a homework assignment. The assignment included questions like, "What is your relationship with your parents like?" and "How was your bed life?" But one question stopped me in my tracks. If you could change one thing about yourself or your relationship, what would it be? That evening, I worked through the questionnaire until I reached that question. I put my pen down, unable to answer it right away. It felt too heavy, too loaded. The next day, after much thought, I finally wrote my response. If I could change one thing, I wish I had been a better husband so my wife wouldn't have fallen out of love with me. At our next session, we handed in our assignments, but Anne didn't review them right away. Instead, she asked if there was anything specific we wanted to discuss. "I'd like to ask Chrissy something," I said immediately and nodded, signaling for me to go on. I turned my attention to Chrissy, meeting her gaze directly. "Chrissy," I began firmly, "I feel like these sessions aren't going anywhere. You made it abundantly clear you're not leaving your friend, Bruce Hartman. That leaves no path for reconciliation. Why don't we end this charade and move forward with a divorce?" Chrissy's eyes widened, her shock unmistakable. "How do you know his name?" she stammered. I held her gaze, my tone steady. "The first time you came to see the kids, I noticed his license plate. It wasn't hard to figure out who he was after that, but his name doesn't matter. I don't care about him and I'm not out for revenge. I just want to move on with my life. I also know your lawyer hasn't been happy with my proposed settlement," I said, steering the conversation back on course. "So I've instructed my attorney to offer some alternatives. I'm willing to expand your visitation time with the kids. I'm also offering $1,000 a month in alimony for 3 years. All I want is to be done with this and move on." Chrissy looked utterly devastated, her sadness almost tangible. Yet, despite her expression, I knew the truth hadn't changed. She wasn't going to leave Bruce. I had long accepted that I couldn't live with the idea of sharing my wife with another man. It baffled me that she thought I ever could, but none of that mattered anymore. All I wanted was an end to the pain. "I've thought a lot about the things you said to me," I added, my voice softer now. "And as much as they hurt at the time, I'm starting to move past it. I've made changes to myself. I'm not the man you dismissed so easily when you decided to be with Bruce. In fact, I've started dating. After we finalize this divorce, you're free to devote all your time to him. But I think it's time we end this. For the kids, if nothing else, they deserve a chance to rebuild their relationship with you." Chrissy broke down completely, tears streaming as she fled the room. Anne looked as shocked as I felt. After a moment, she regained her composure and said she wanted to meet with Chrissy alone for the next session, followed by a solo session with me. I agreed with a sigh. Months ago, when Chrissy first dropped her bombshell, I had been consumed by anger and hatred. But now I just felt drained. This situation wasn't only tearing me apart, it was hurting Chrissy, her parents, and worst of all, our children. All I wanted was for the pain to stop. By the time I sat down for my final session with Anne, a sense of relief washed over me. I was glad Chrissy wasn't there, and even more grateful that this session marked the end of counseling. Anne began the conversation with a calm, but deliberate tone. "Ron, I want to commend you for your patience and composure throughout these sessions. I know this situation has been incredibly painful. After meeting with Chrissy last week, I believe I've gained a clearer understanding of what led to her actions." I leaned forward slightly, a mix of curiosity and caution rising within me. Maybe, just maybe, I was about to get some real insight into why Chrissy had destroyed our marriage. "Do you remember the homework assignment I gave you?" Anne asked, her eyes steady on mine. I nodded, though the memory was vague. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming it hadn't contributed significantly to the process. "There was one question in particular that stood out," she continued, pulling 2 sheets of paper from the folder on her lap. "It was the one that asked, if you could change one thing, what would it be?" My brow furrowed slightly as I nodded again, still uncertain of where she was headed. "You wrote that you wish you'd been a better husband, so Chrissy wouldn't have stopped loving you," Anne said, her voice measured but empathetic. She paused, letting her words sink in, then added, "When Chrissy read that, she completely broke down. It was the most emotional I've ever seen her, and it took a long time to calm her down." I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed silent. "Ron," Anne said softly, "your wife never stopped loving you." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "That's why she jumped into bed with Bruce, right? Out of love for me? Anne sighed, clearly disappointed by my tone. Ron, Chrissy's actions were driven by a severe midlife crisis. As the kids got older, she felt like her purpose was slipping away. Chrissy has always been a nurturing person, and when she met Bruce, a man deeply in need, she confused her longing for purpose in youth with love. That doesn't excuse what she did, I said firmly. She still chose to betray me. She's not with Bruce anymore. Anne revealed. That caught me off guard. What? Then why didn't she tell me? She believed it wouldn't make a difference. Anne explained. Bruce left town the same day you told Chrissy you were dating someone and moving forward with a divorce. She assumed she'd already lost you. I thought about that for a moment, but Anne was right. It didn't change anything. Too much had happened, and I was finally on a path that felt right for me. There was no going back. More importantly, I needed Chrissy to focus on rebuilding her bond with the kids. Sally's grades had plummeted, Kyle had become withdrawn, and even Ronran, who seemed the most stable, avoided any mention of his mother. Before we wrap up, there's one more thing I want to share, Anne said, handing me a piece of paper. This is Chrissy's response to the same question. She wrote that if she could change one thing, it would be that she never met Bruce Hartman. The divorce was finalized not long after, with Chrissy granted visitation on Wednesdays and Fridays. Initially, our interactions were awkward and formal, but over time, we began sharing occasional meals as a family. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, Chrissy hesitated before asking, Ron, would it be okay if I stayed the night? I chuckled, shaking my head. No, Chrissy, the spare room isn't exactly comfortable, and you'd be better off heading home. As for Bruce Hartman, I eventually learned the full story. His wife hadn't died in an accident, as Chrissy had believed. She had been speeding away from him after catching him cheating. Poetic justice arrived in the form of a bar fight. Bruce ended up with 5 broken ribs, a shattered kneecap, several missing teeth, and most notably, 2 crushed nuts. Chrissy slowly rebuilt her relationship with the kids, though Ronran always maintained some emotional distance. He was polite but reserved, never fully letting her back in. 3 years later, I remarried. The woman I married was Sally's teacher. She became an integral part of our family, and the kids adored her. Chrissy never completely accepted that I had moved on, but as I had once told her, the discussion was over. She had 2 choices, accept it or don't. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.